Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. We host Madlik Disruptive Torah on your favorite podcast platform and now on YouTube and Substack. We also publish a source sheet on Sefaria, and a link is included in the show notes. I'm recording this last Haggadah Insight during Chol HaMoed, and even though the Seder is behind us, I wonder if you, like me, still have it on your mind. What's bothering me is, where is the stranger? Everybody asks why Moses is missing from the Haggadah. It's a good question, but I don't think it's the right one. Because if the Exodus story is meant to shape our moral imagination, then maybe we should be asking something else. Where is the stranger? The Torah could not be clearer, not once, not twice, but over and over again. Some say 36 times. You shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And even more radically, V'ahavtam et hager ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This isn't a side note. It's the moral center of the Torah, or what those in marketing called a CTA, a call to action. And yet, on the night when we tell the story of being strangers, on the night when we relive oppression, on the night when we celebrate liberation, the stranger is missing. No section, no voice, no seat at the table. I hear you objecting, wait, don't we begin the Seder with Kol dichvin yetei v'echal, all who are hungry, come and eat? Beautiful, open, generous, but let's be honest. Is that really the stranger? Or is it an invitation to those already inside our circle and community? So I think the answer is hiding in plain sight, especially if you study the Mishnah. The Mishnah in Pesachim tells us how to tell the story. Matchil b'genut u'mesayim b'shvach, begin with disgrace and end with praise. And here's what we all remember, this oddity, and expound from my father was a wandering Aramean, continues the Mishnah, until you complete the entire section. Ad shigmor kol haparsha kula, until the end. So this is the parsha we call Bikurim. We started Counter the Omer on the second night of the Seder. That leads till Shavuot, which is the harvest festival par excellence, and we bring the Bikurim, the first fruits, to the priest, and we follow a very ancient formula. And it starts literally with, my forefather was a wandering Aramean, and this is what, according to the Mishnah, is the crux, is the core of the Magid section of telling our story. As I said before, it begins with our humble beginnings and ends with a crescendo of how great we are. And as the Mishnah says, you have to read it, kol parsha kulo, the whole parsha, until the end. And we don't. So let me read it to you, so you really remember where we are in the Seder. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers. We stop, we read a commentary. And sojourned then, we read a commentary. But there he became a great and very populous nation. We stop there. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. We stop there. We are conducting a Mishnaic learning session. We are quoting these verses that the Mishnah says are really important for Magid, and we're parsing each one and telling each one. And we go on, and then it says in verse 8, the Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand. We stop there. By an outstretched arm and awesome power. We stop there. And by signs and wonders. And that's where the Haggadah stops quoting. It doesn't quote verse 9 that says, he brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. We don't quote verse 10. Therefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O Lord, have given me. You shall leave it before the Lord your God, and bow low before the Lord your God. And we don't read the next verse, because if we read it to the end, we would land here. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, and you shall rejoice, you and the stranger in your midst. Ata v'halevi v'hager asher bikir b'cha. That's it. Hager asher bikir b'cha is the punchline. It's the end. It's what the Mishnah says we have to read until. That's the punchline. Not just liberation, shared joy. Not just leaving Egypt, creating a society that includes the ger, the other. So why was it removed? Why was it cut? Because the rabbis who shaped the Haggadah lived in exile. They couldn't bear to say we are in the land. They couldn't celebrate shared prosperity. And the ending with the ger, the stranger, when you're at the bottom of the social order, you don't talk about how to treat the stranger. You are the stranger. So they stopped the story early. And in doing so, they removed the ger. But the Torah had already warned us before Egypt, before redemption, with Abraham and Sarai, the first Jews. They are vulnerable, displaced, dependent, and then they have power over Hagar, the Egyptian, the stranger. And what happens? As Rabbi Shai held in a lecture called An Exodus for Egyptians, reading Genesis and Isaiah together, Rabbi Shai held in the Jerome L. Stern pre-Passover lecture in 2021, quoting Tikva Free-Mokensky writes, with regard to Sarah's statement of her slave Hagar, we like to believe that the experience of suffering makes us more sympathetic to the suffering of others. It does not. Sarai's own experience as a slave does not make her more empathetic to the slave in her own home. On the contrary, it makes her want to assert her dominance and authority so she won't lose it again. As usual, the biblical narrator does not comment on the actions. It is left to the reader to note how easily the oppressed can become oppressors. When God raises high the lowly, how will the newly empowered behave toward those who lack power and autonomy? That's the end of the quote that Shai held brought of Tikva Frei-Mokensky. And it made me think, when we talk about humble beginnings, is it truly going far back enough to my ancestor was a wandering Aramean? Or might we not go back to Sarai and Hagar? The first slave in the Bible was not a Jewish slave to Egyptians, but as Shai held points out, it was an Egyptian slave to early Jews. And now, a word from our sponsor. If there's one thing we value at Madlik Podcast, it's reading texts and talking about them. That's why I'm excited to share something I created called Voice Gift Play. It fits in the palm of your hand like a remote control and clips onto any book. It's inspired by those old school museum audio guides, but this is personal. Voice Gift Play stores up to 10 hours of audio across 999 numbered recordings. You simply enter a number to record a comment, memory, or explanation, and enter the same number to play it back. It's perfect for B'nai Mitzvah practicing their laning, capturing Grandpa's favorite tune, or recording Chad Gad Yar in a voice that matters. Go to voice.gift. That's www.voice.gift and use code Madlik for 15% off. Thanks. And now back to our podcast. Which brings us to now. For the first time in 2,000 years, we are no longer only telling the story. We are living inside of it. We are back in the land of Israel, which means the part of the Haggadah HaMitz is no longer theoretical and frankly should not and no longer be omitted. And that changes everything, because now we can no longer stop at V'yotzienu Hashem miMitzrayim, God took us out of Egypt. We must continue. V'yavenu el hamakom hazeh v'yiten lanu et haaretz hazot. And he brought us to this place, and he gave us this land, Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, this land of milk and honey. And then the Torah says in verse 10, Va'ata, and now. This is the exclamation, the blessing, the affirmation of he who is truly celebrating and bringing the first fruits. And it goes on to say that you gave me these fruits, you gave me this bounty, I am going to bow before God, v'samachta b'chol hatov asher natan lecha Hashem Elokecha, and you shall enjoy and be happy with all the good that God gave you. Ata v'halevi v'hager asher b'kubecha. That should actually be part of our Haggadah, and we should be parsing every word in those verses the same way we do with the prior verses. And when we get to v'hager asher b'kubecha, we should be telling a midrash very similar to what Shai held and what Tikva Freimer Kensky has told. Because redemption is not just about leaving oppression, it's about what you do with power. And this is not an abstract thought. Rabbi Kenneth Brander, the Rosh Hashiva of Or Torah, recently wrote, clearly and courageously against extremist violence by Jews against Palestinians in the West Bank. His argument is not political, it is Torah-based, that violence against the vulnerable betrays the very story we tell at the Seder. And this exposes a real struggle within religious Zionism, because religious Zionism tells a story of return, of redemption, but the Torah's story does not end with return. It ends with responsibility. So the question is not, did we make it back to the land? The question is, what do we do now that we have power? We spend the night telling a story. But the Mishnah tells us how to tell it. Start with shame, end with praise. So what is the real praise? Not that we made it to the land, but that we learned the lesson, that we remember we were strangers, and therefore we make space for the stranger. Because the true test of leaving Egypt is not how we remember the past, it's how we treat the other, the ger. Now that we are no longer strangers. Moadim l'simcha.